Welcome to BreakPoint this week. I'm Shane Morris, and I'm here with John Stonestreet to discuss the stories of the week from a Christian worldview perspective. John, we've got a bunch of different headlines and articles we want to get to today, but probably the one with the most far-reaching consequences, which we've continued over the past week to talk about here at the Colson Center, is the Supreme Court's Bostock decision. We actually ran a commentary earlier this week in which you talked about the seismic implications of the decision and how further down the road we're going to see all sorts of consequences unfold on a legal level and also on a cultural level from the inclusion of SOGI categories in Title VII of the Civil Rights Act.
Yeah, and it's really on two fronts, I think, Shane. First, the first front is, folks like David French are saying it's not that big of a deal. There's really strong religious freedom protections there. Let's just be clear what we're talking about. There's really strong religious freedom protections in other statutes and laws, RFRA and other places, for religious institutions, for churches, for Christian, nonprofits. What there's not good protections for are, first of all, nonprofits or religious educational institutions that take federal dollars. Now, we could debate on whether they should have taken federal dollars, but that cat's so far out of the bag, it's not going to be put back in. This will affect the vast majority of Christian colleges and universities. Eventually, there won't be any sort of way to prevent Title VII implications in this case from being applied to Title IX. And Title IX has everything to do with educational access on the basis of sex, which includes sports teams, and it includes all kinds of other things, as scholarship opportunities, dorms, housing, facilities, and so on. So that's the first thing that we got to be really clear on. And second, we need to go back to what religious freedom is. I'm glad that there are strong protections for pastors and for churches and for Christian nonprofits. But that's not what religious freedom is. Religious freedom isn't protection for religious institutions to exist or for pastors to preach from the pulpit. America's religious freedom protections have been for parishioners to basically live out their faith from the pew.
Well,
and that's
as you pointed out in the commentary, John, this leaves the government in the role of deciding what constitutes a religious institution, and then who gets to be protected under that religious institution.
And we should all have PTSD from from the HHS mandate about that. I mean, when the Obama administration defined what counts as a religious institution,
nuns
churches over 50 were left out. Yeah, nuns were left out, right? I mean, people who provided services for, listen to this, people who provided services for anyone outside of their own faith. I mean, that's the whole mission of the church forever, right? And the line between what counts as religious and what counts as secular is not a line that the Bible draws. By the way, it's not a line that the Constitution draws. It's not a line that the Bill of Rights draw. I forget whether I'm plural or singular using the verb right here, but you know what I mean. Like, this is a completely fabricated category, but this will enshrine that distinction in law, and that's a huge loss. It's a huge loss. Look, I think if I shouldn't be forced in my church to preach a sermon that's against my conviction, that Jack Phillips shouldn't be forced to communicate a message in his line of work either. And of course, Jack Phillips being the cake artist in Colorado.
Yeah, I'm not a lawyer, but I'm a little confused as to how these cases are going to be reconciled, because Masterpiece Cake Shop, in that case, the court found that Jack Phillips did not have to. It was a narrow decision, so it wasn't quite what ADF and other groups were looking for. But they did end up saying that Jack Phillips was treated badly by the Civil Rights Commission in his state, and so he should be allowed to, demur from baking a cake with a particular message. He can't be forced to say something. But I wonder, how does that reconcile with a decision that in effect equates, as it touches employment, SOGI categories with race and sex? I'm not really sure how that's going to shake out. Like, if Jack Phillips were hiring, would he now have to hire someone who was who identified in that way, but he doesn't have to bake a particular kind of cake? I don't know. It's very confusing.
Well, that's it. I mean, this has to do with employment law, right? And
Right.
To be honest, I believe, at least it's the case in some of these situations, I think it's the case, if I remember, that Jack Phillips in particular had hired LGBT employees, right? But that's different than saying, Jack, who communicate messages of congratulations, of sacredness, of amazing things using paintbrushes on cakes. This is the message you have to say. You don't have to say that these two men are married. That's a completely different sort of thing. But do they run in conflict? Does one lead to the other? Well, of course, yeah. I mean, in terms of, because what it does, Shane, is that it slowly but surely shrinks the space where your public convictions can live, right?
It ghettoizes faith.
Yeah, that's right. But it also puts this in the category of protection, as if it won't impact employment whatsoever. Mm-hmm. And of course, that was the strange thing. The other thing too is that I just think judges of any ilk, and I think any elected officials, we are just not dealing with reality when we allow the T to be piggybacked on the L and the G, right? So these were three cases, two of them having to do with gay employees, one having to do with transgender employees. These aren't the same issues at all. This isn't, and by the way, there's a whole lot of L's and a whole lot of G's and a whole lot of B's that say the T's, aren't welcome anymore, and are tired of this hijacking of the movement. And it has been on every level, but that's probably a different conversation.
Just before we started here, John, you sent me an article in the Wall Street Journal by David Crawford and Michael Hanby, and it's called The Abolition of Man and Woman. And the subtitle is...
I knew that C.S. Lewis title would catch your attention, by the way.
Yeah, absolutely. And I was glad they gave Lewis credit for the line at the end there and quoted The Abolition of Man. But they write that the court has intervened in a bitterly contested question, a question of philosophy before it is a question of law, and codified a radical new conception of human nature with a dubious ideological history. It has inscribed into law the abolition of man and woman. So I wonder about this characterization, because it's just so different from what Justice Gorsuch described in his decision. He described it as a very narrow sort of application of the literal concrete concept of sex to the situation of discrimination against sexual orientation and gender identity. But the effect, Crawford and Hanby seem to think, is that this is actually going to undefine sex in law. And I had some pushback on Facebook this morning when I posted that from some lawyer friends who said, well, no, it's not, they're overreacting. This isn't exactly what the decision is. And though I disagree with it, I'm not sure that's what they were telling me. So I'm not sure. I disagree with the decision as well. I'm trying to figure out how far these implications go, because it does seem to be very far reaching, like they say.
Well, yeah. And look, I think those who are saying that it's not a big deal are looking at the way Gorsuch did it. I mean, right. People who expected this to be a win for the employees expected it to be a win on the basis of the Supreme Court actually saying that the sexual orientation and gender identity were equivalent with race. And some ideas are, well, that's why John Roberts did not allow, for example, Sonia Sotomayor or Elena Kagan or somebody like that to write the opinion. Mm. You get somebody like Gorsuch, and what he said was, no, there are different categories. And those different categories were intended back when the Civil Rights Act was passed with all of its various aspects. But there's no possible way to discriminate against sexual orientation and gender identity without discriminating against sex. Right. It was a textualist way of gutting the whole idea, and I mean, it was creative. You give it that. I mean, it was like I said, it was Kennedy-esque. I mean, it was even better than Kennedy, if you ask me, because Kennedy just flat out invented stuff. Right? He just found
stuff hiding in the penumbra.
I mean, he used the word penumbra first of all, and my guess is he learned that word in 8th grade, and he just looked forward to the day that he could finally use it. It's
an SAT word. It's definitely on the SAT.
And he dropped it. But so at least in a sense, Gorsuch tried to pull it out of the text itself. But I don't understand how then that's not going to be applied from here on out. Mm-hmm. That if you discriminate against sexual orientation and gender identity in terms of people's wishes, in terms of participation in sports teams or facilities.
Could the justices try to draw a separate category where it's legitimate to discriminate on the basis of sex because the thing you've set up is devoted particularly to one sex, like a sports team for women or a locker room or something like that?
In this day and age, no. I mean, it's hard to imagine that that's the case. But look, didn't we hear this about Obergefell? Like, how's my gay marriage going to hurt you?
Right.
And then, well, go ask Jack Phillips, and go ask Baron L. Stutzman, and go ask, whoever else. And then it's like, oh, well, no, that's justified. This is just how we all have to get along. Well, that's exactly where this goes. I get that the slippery slope argument is a logical fallacy, but man, it's a realistic thing. If the slope is slanted and it's greased, you're going to slide. And this is this sort of language game that Gorsuch played, plus the cultural impulse. I mean, again, we said this last week, I believe, but the idea that culture is upstream from these sorts of things, that the broader entertainment, media, educational culture is upstream from it, is so obvious in this case, because he so tried to play by the rules and also get to the outcome that he wanted to get to, and it was such a bizarre sort of thing. It wasn't on cultural evolution, like Kennedy said in the Obergefell decision. But it was very much like, we can't turn around and go back, so we got to find a way to get there. And I just can't imagine how this is not going to be applied now to more and more areas of law.
We've got a lot more to cover, folks. Stay with us. We'll be right back after this. We're back here on BreakPoint this week, talking about the stories of the week from a Christian worldview perspective. And John, another story that jumped out at us this week, it seems like transgenderism is the theme this week, much to my chagrin. But another story came out of Idaho that was actually, I think, very positive. It's something that I can applaud. Idaho became the first state in the nation to pass a law protecting female athletes in public schools and colleges from being forced to compete against biological males. And of course, the ACLU is now suing them. There were a number of track runners and female athletes who spoke out bravely, I think, in support of the law. Among them was Madison Kenyon, who told World Magazine, male athletes are taller, they're broader, they're bigger, they can run faster. No matter what I do, I can't keep up with them. It's unfair and discouraging. So
well, let's just stop right there and say, Shane, how is that I mean, it's true that all of that's true, but the fact that she has to say that out loud.
Right.
How I mean, this is Romans 1, denying observable realities, right? You deny the creator, and then you deny the human being, and then things just wrong is right and right is wrong, and up is down and down is up. And I mean, the fact that that's a revolutionary statement that she said, and that she had to say that out loud as a legal argument is really the key point we should all take away here, which is this is an amazing place to be.
I'd love to sit down with some of the most enthusiastic transgender activists, the ones who aren't going to just scream at me and wave signs and sling slogans, and ask what the alternative is exactly. What do these folks want from locker rooms, from schools, from athletic programs? Do they just want to let women get crushed in sports, or just sort of put their head in the sand and forget about it and pretend it doesn't exist, pretend there is no disparity between the sexes when it comes to athletic ability? Do they want to make women share locker rooms with people who have male parts? I mean, how's that progressive? How's that feminist?
It's not
really
feminist,
don't understand.
And it's going to be interesting to see, for example, where Martina Navratilova, the other tennis great that's in this conversation, where she lands, because she obviously got in trouble a few months ago for not being woke enough on this issue. Shane, there is a level at which, what would they say? This is an important question. My guess is, based on from people who have commented on this, from who identify as transgender and struggle with gender dysphoria and so on, is that no, it's not fair, but that's okay. It's not fair, but this is important if society is supposed to move on from its discrimination and hatred. And it underscores something that's really important. And I want to say this really carefully, but something that I'm just convinced of, so I need to say it. People who struggle with gender dysphoria are struggling with a profound identity crisis. And there's nothing more challenging than that. I mean, that is the ultimate loss of meaning if you don't know who you are at that sort of core level, right? And if you're at a point where you think that an inner voice, essentially an inner notion, an inner meaning that you have, an inner self-determination that you have, that's not supported by any physical evidence whatsoever, right? It's actually propped up by gender stereotypes that the culture has been denouncing for years.
Right.
But you have no other source for this, right? Every time you look in the mirror, what you see contradicts this voice, this inner voice, this inner sense of who you are. I mean, can you imagine a more miserable place to be? Now, what that does is it creates a sense of trauma. And where that leads is one of two places. We know that it leads to an incredibly high rate of self-destruction, self-harm, and suicide, which is an awful place to be. The other place that it leads is a inability to see anybody other than yourself. And I've been thinking a lot about this, and I want to say this really carefully, but there's something inherently narcissistic. And when we think about narcissistic, we think about, the Karens of the world, who can't see beyond themselves. I hate using that word. I wish I hadn't done that. Forgive me. But it's everybody knows what I'm talking about, right? But I'm
going to speak to your manager about this, John.
Yeah, please do. But I don't know if you know what I mean, Shane, but there's an in-depth, a deep level narcissism that's not just irritating, it's so deeply brainwashing that it is a disturbing, it leads to a disturbing inability to see reality as it actually is, as if everything in the world revolves around this self-interest. So you either, or this self-sense. So think about looking in the mirror every day and seeing this incongruence. That's a personal identity crisis. But where does that take you? It takes you to either destroy yourself or to try to reorient all of reality around that. I've seen it in some people close to me. I'll tell you a story, and I've debated on whether to tell this story. But someone I know very well, part of my extended relationships growing up, identifies as a transgender, in his 30s, and is in the arts community in New York City. At the beginning of COVID-19, he posted some, voice lessons and coaching that he was going to offer for his community, trying to be, make money while he was laid off during COVID-19, which is a noble thing to do.
Right.
But in the middle of this, he says, as a trans artist with no familial support. Let me tell you what the backstory of this, Shane. The backstory of this is that this young man was completely supported in his artistic endeavors by his parents. They paid for piano lessons. They paid for drama lessons. They paid for art camp. They paid for him to go to school to study this in Florida, where he dropped out, and then go to West Virginia, where he graduated. They helped him get to New York City. They financially supported him through the whole thing. During this whole year, this young man's father has had for 2 years now, has had a chronic medical condition, which has led to an enormous, all kinds of medical expenses, including depression, anxiety for the whole family. Not only that, but had to have brain surgery last week. This young man is in his 30s. Shane, would you post that you have no familial? You're in your 30s, right? Would you post that you have no familial support in your business in your 30s? Like, what are you expecting?
that's
a handout from your mom and dad? But what I saw this, and I know this individual really well, and what I struggle with is the inability to think outside of himself. And that's one thing when you're looking in the mirror and you're struggling with an identity crisis. It's another thing when the whole culture is enabling a sense of narcissism.
Well, I think that's exactly the right observation, John, because this isn't something that just sort of originates in the individual a lot of times. It's something that originates externally in a movement that then sort of bends the individual's own experiences and concerns into the mold of the movement. And I talked with someone this week for the podcast. The episode will be coming out shortly, with Naomi Riley, who wrote this amazing review in Commentary Magazine of Abigail Schreier's Irreversible Damage, which is a new book on transgenderism, particularly among teenage girls. And she talks about how the transgender movement has become very much like a cult, where there's recruitment going on, online, where young girls especially are being subjected to what one researcher called a social contagion effect, where they just in groups almost. This has been observed in the UK and the United States in groups. Young girls who were previously the least likely group to declare themselves transgender or to experience gender dysphoria are now all of a sudden experiencing it en masse together and deciding to transition. And the only script that we're allowed to speak over their lives is affirmation. We're only allowed to say that, well, this is your true self. This is who you are. Ignore the statistics that say the vast majority of you will desist at some point and go back to identifying with your birth sex. Ignore all the manipulation that took place along the way. Ignore the damage, the irreversible damage, as the title of the book has it, that we're inflicting on these young women along the way through hormone therapy and even in some cases surgery. We're just going to sacrifice them to this idea that has taken hold of our culture and is writing the script for all of their lives. And I don't think those young women would have come up with that stuff on their own. I think they're being swept up along with it. They are, in a very real sense, victims here.
Well, look, I mean, I was stunned to see a New York protest for Black Lives Matter become Black Trans Lives Matter. Can you imagine any other movement that would be allowed to hijack right now the racial protest without it just being complete appropriation?
No, I
Can
cannot.
you imagine any other area of American culture in which this sort of idea that completely runs, not only where there's no evidence to support it, but it runs counter to all the evidence that we have? I mean, think about, like, for example, the people that are convinced about Area 51 or are convinced that, of any number of conspiracy theories, right? We don't allow any of them to live in their delusions, certainly not to reorient society and to force others to participate in those delusions. We certainly don't do it with other health conditions.
The best analogy we have, John, as far as health goes, is anorexia and bulimia, because it's a delusion about your body, about your physical state, and how it doesn't match up with your mental state. And you go to a doctor with that. No doctor in the world is going to say, okay, well, you are fat, we're going to help you lose weight, because they know they'll kill you doing that. Your delusion doesn't reflect reality. But if someone, as Naomi Riley pointed out to me, if someone comes to a doctor saying, well, I have gender dysphoria, I think I'm the opposite sex, I think deep down inside I was born in the wrong body, the doctor is now obligated, on pain of basically losing his or her career, to say, okay, yes, I affirm you. I'm going to treat you accordingly. It's the only condition in medicine, John, where the patient comes to the doctor with a diagnosis and expects treatment instead of the doctor diagnosing the patient.
Yeah, it is. I was speaking to a group of students on some of these issues this week, and you kind of back up, and the thing that parents and grandparents and youth pastors need to understand is, you have to now then talk the rest of American teenagers out of this delusion as well, right? Like, you have to say it in these really direct ways. And for example, there's literally no evidence whatsoever for this ideology. It flies in the face of everything we can observably see, not to mention what we know about chromosomes. It is believing something with absolutely no evidence. None. I mean, there's nothing. It is like looking in the mirror and seeing something that is completely not there. And like you said, I think, eating disorders are a great example of that, because you have a very skinny person looking in the mirror, seeing something that's just not true about themselves. And it's heartbreaking and it's awful. And there'll be a reckoning on this someday of what essentially is child abuse. That these fantasies of grown men, primarily, because the activists here are grown men, and that's created this dearth of masculinity, and that's where you see so many women moving. It goes in that direction. That's more than we can cover here, but we need to talk about that at some point. Which came first here: the transgender male or the transgender female? And I'm using that phrase.
Sorry.
Yeah, just to be clear, I'm using that phrase in exactly an opposite way of what I'm supposed to, just intentionally. But it's that came first. Anyway, we probably need to move on. But that's it's a disturbing thing, and it hits so close to home for me. And I've been wrestling with that story because where does that level of narcissism come from? I mean, as a 30-year-old, I would have never said, cried about not having family support from my business. I'm a grown man, right? Like, what? Why would my parents send me a check? Especially ones that supported me the whole time and are going through a medical crisis. What am I asking them to do? It's insane. It's crazy. But I say that not in a derogatory way, just trying to shake up and go, this is a delusion of narcissism that runs about as deep as you can get. I can't imagine it going much deeper.
We're going to take another quick break, and we'll be right back after this. We're going to hit one more story this week that I think is important to talk about. Stay with us. We're back on BreakPoint this week, talking about the stories of the week from a Christian worldview perspective. And John, we've been talking a lot about transgenderism, but the other headline this week that just seemed to be floating around again and again and again for different reasons and in different places is this war on statues that's going on around the country. We've got protesters turning on the more lithic and bronze among our number, and are toppling statues of it. Well, it started with Confederate generals and figures for obvious reasons, but it's moved on now to George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, Christopher Columbus, Ulysses Grant of all people, famous evangelist and abolitionist, even, and now even a statue of Jesus, as I understand it. And the latest is that the Museum of Natural History in New York, this wasn't done by a mob, this was actually an official decision of the museum, has announced that it'll be removing a famous statue of President Teddy Roosevelt, flanked by a Native American man and an African American man. And this has sort of been the culmination thus far of an effort to expunge racism from American history. But I think this is really misguided. I think this is running off the rails. And there was a great piece in the Washington Post by Henry Olson, who argued that the anti-statue movement, he approves of some of the removal of Confederate statues, for instance, but he argues that the movement itself has just taken a turn into absurdity.
Yeah. I mean, it is important to make this distinction. And these distinctions now are no longer being made, between.
I don't think they were ever made, really. I mean, not by the mobs.
Right. Well, and that's what happens. I just go back to something Andy Crouch wrote at the beginning of COVID-19, that we need less information and more context. And that includes historical context, because if you can't see the difference between a statue that was erected in the middle of a Southern Jim Crow town in order to intimidate and remind, African Americans of the slave past, to celebrate people of bad character for no reason whatsoever other than intimidation, and those things which are historical, those things, for example, where individuals made incredible, contributions to the American story. It tells you one of the things that Os Guinness said years ago, which is this is an impossible project. America is an impossible project without a shared civic memory. And it certainly means we have, in very real senses, whitewashed American history, and it's telling, and we need to get back to actually being honest with what the history was. But there also is this idea, on the other hand, of, look, not everything can be seen through this lens of critical theory. And that's really the problem. And one of the things you're seeing, and this is kind of in our recent videos on what would you say about critical theory, as well as our recent BreakPoint, this idea that critical theory is destructive. It doesn't construct anything. It can't actually put you past something. It can only point out what's wrong. And it doesn't always point out what's wrong in the right way. This is kind of like this is a tangible, physical example of tearing down, but unable to build up.
Well, that's exactly Olson's closing line in his piece. He says, "It is easy to destroy. It is hard to build. The American edifice that imperfect men and women have built over the past 2 centuries is a solid foundation for the nation in which we live and seek to improve. We must not burn it down in the vain hope that a better future can emerge from its bonfire." That's great writing.
Yeah, it is great writing. Henry Olson is a great writer and a good guy. But I will say this as well. I appreciated our friends over at Evolution News, one of the publications of the ID movement, asking, "Hey, when are they going to tear down the statues of Darwin? Like, if anyone is responsible, right, for the theory that gave us what we have seen in modern day racism, it is Charles Darwin." I mean, it's unavoidable. I mean, I often say this: if Darwin had stayed in biology, it wouldn't have been a big deal. But he didn't. He couldn't. And once it jumped to sociology, it was on. Yeah, that's right. He did not stay in biology. He jumped to sociology, and that was that. So the that's an interesting conversation. We might have to do some more on that.
Yeah, for sure. Descent of Man is a shocking read. Some of the things he says in that, and it just seems like, I mean, it's kind of tongue in cheek, because I don't want people toppling statues of Charles Darwin either, but it does seem like that would be an opportune target. But it's kind of funny that he's left out. We're back on our third segment here of BreakPoint this week, which has become our Q&A segment. And John, we've got 3 questions this week. I don't know if we'll be able to get to all of them, but the first one here is very simple, and it's sort of a legal question. Now, I'm not a lawyer, you're not a lawyer, but we do read some lawyers, and I think we could maybe perhaps shed some light on the implications here. Listener asks, does this decision force churches to hire LGBT people? Will it force churches to conduct marriages for LGBT people?
No, the answer is no. We kind of covered that earlier as well when we talked about the Bostock decision earlier in the program, but it doesn't. And that's because there are very clear religious exemptions in the Civil Rights Act, going back. And there's also very strong religious protections for religious institutions, particularly churches, houses of worship, in all kinds of legislation, including state level RFRAs, Religious Freedom Restoration Acts in state after state, and so on. So no, I don't see this actually impacting that. And like I said, I think and I've said this on a number of occasions, I think for pastors concerned that they're going to be forced to tell a message or perform a wedding, that's a long way off, right? I don't make a lot of predictions about the future, but that is a long way off. But that's not, again, I need to go back to, that's not what we mean by religious freedom. Right. I heard during the Obergefell decision, I heard too many pastors say, well, I'll take a stand when they come to the door of my church. That's not what religious freedom is. It's not protections of conscience inside the church or inside your home. Or inside your own head. It's protections of conscience in your public and daily life, including your place of employment. So that's where the real consequence for religious freedom is going to come.
I would add that what you're talking about in terms of further down the road, the things that are going to threaten church religious liberty inside the church walls, in pastors' own ministry, it's in seed form in I think this decision, in that there's an equation being made here between the discrimination against someone on the basis of gender identity, for instance, and discrimination on the basis of sex or race. And I don't think that anybody, even if there's not a legal condemnation here, I think there's an implicit moral condemnation, which is coming from the court. And that's gonna change culture. That's gonna affect the way people perceive. And this is one of your points in the BreakPoint this week about the Bostock decision, was that the court is acting as a teacher in this case and a cultural leader, and it's going to be pushing people in the direction of equating these things on a cultural level, and then marginalizing Christians who aren't willing to equate it, even in their own houses of worship, because that's bigoted, that's animus, that's on the same level as not accepting people into your lunch counter because of the color of their skin. So I think there is a moral condemnation here that's going to have impacts down the road.
Listen, this is a huge point. And if you were listening to the podcast and you just caught the end of that, you need to rewind and listen to what Shane just said, because this is a very, very important thing. I was thinking about this driving back from Wyoming last week, is the role of the law as a teacher, right? I mean, listen, when I was growing up, we never buckled our seatbelts. Nobody in our family did. We certainly didn't put any kid in a car seat. I mean, we were bouncing around, and all that sort of stuff.
Well, John, seatbelts are very important unless you put 40 kids in a single vehicle together.
Then they can't move.
They're not important, right?
Yeah, then they serve as airbags for each other. But but what changed all that was a law and a whole public media campaign. And you put those two things together, and now every time I get in the car, my kids make sure I'm wearing my seatbelt, right? It's the flip of culture. I'm not saying that's a bad thing. I'm just saying that most always culture is upstream from law and politics, but sometimes it goes the other direction, and they have a mutually enforcing capacity on each other. And I think that's a really important point. And by the way, I think the writers in the Wall Street Journal article that we mentioned earlier make a similar point. And we'll link to that at breakpoint.org that Shane just made. This is a really important thing, that once it's in the law, it won't force churches to hire LGBT people or conduct marriages for LGBT folks. But a lot of churches will now, because it will increase and I say now, it will lead to churches caving on this, because Obergefell led to churches caving on this without being forced to. And this will reinforce that you're a bad person. After all, it's in the Civil Rights Act, right? It's equated now in law with race. And it will be hard for churches who think that truth and love are in conflict with each other to navigate that. It's a really important point, Shannon. I'm glad you brought it up.
Here's a question, John, that I think we just need to get to. It's so urgent, and it just struck my heart to read it. It's very simple. The listener asks, I need advice. A Christian friend with ALS is considering ending his life. He's asking me for feedback, and this is someone in Canada, referring to the medical aid in dying laws that are on the books there.
Yeah, man, what a brutal question, and God bless you as you seek to do this, and thanks for speaking into someone's life. You're already living, by asking this question and wanting to do something, you're already living in a countercultural way, in a culture that says that the most Christian loving thing to do is to affirm someone in their own choices. This is why we have so many Christians unwilling to speak about abortion, really. They don't like it, not sure whether it should be legal or not, and that sort of thing. And, the fact that you're willing to say, no, I need to step into this is really important. Shane, we were in the middle of a conversation this week, and we were talking about kind of the brave new world, a group of us, of what all of this means. And you and I have talked a long time here about pre-existing conditions that existed pre-COVID, George Floyd's horrific killing, and so on, and how this has escalated so much of that. Our need as a Christian community to care about people who are vulnerable is as great as it's ever been. I keep going back to this line from Stanley Hauerwas, who I'm theologically not on the same page with on a lot of things, but I fully affirm. He said, 100 years from now, if Christians are known for not killing their babies and not killing their elderly, we will have done well. I would say,
Amen.
Obviously, I hope that's not all we're known for, but if we're not at least known for that, then we will have abandoned the gospel and shamed the name of Jesus Christ. And I don't know how else to say it. So what do you say to this question? First of all, there's not a lot you can say. You have to love. You have to be there. There is pain management that we are good with, that we have figured out as a society. But we need to up our game in palliative care pretty dramatically. And we need people of faith that are there. My pastor says that when he challenges people who want to, end their life early in quote unquote legal or illegal ways, he challenges, because of suffering, he challenges them that if you care about your family, you won't do this. Because what's often argued is that I don't want to be an unnecessary financial burden.
Right.
He says your greatest time of influence on your kids is for them to watch how you die. And that is a countercultural view, that pain removes our dignity. What if our greatest dignity comes in our ability to love and to live and so on? And this has to do with the dignity and value of life. And somehow we have to communicate to the dying and the suffering that their dying and suffering has a purpose, that their dying and suffering actually teaches their kids and loved ones. It's the greatest moment of influence that they can have on them. And so on. And of course, ultimately, there's a theological question of who owns life. And it's amazing how many things in Genesis 1, Genesis 2, throughout the Bible that we see that God has given over to human beings to own and to steward. Life is not one of them. God holds the keys to life and death. That's it. We even see that in Job. God gives a bunch of stuff over to Satan, does not give life and death over to him. So this is a profound thing. And it's so countercultural what you're doing. Thank you for doing it. But that means it's so hard to talk against what this guy wants to do because it's so profoundly countercultural. So God bless you as you do it. I would say last thing, Shane, sorry, I'm rambling here a little bit, but let me just say that we need to put a link to a wonderful session that Ben Mitchell gave in our last short course on how to care for the dying. And there's a lot of ideas in that presentation. It's an hour or so long presentation, and we'll link to that if you come to breakpoint.org and click on the link for the podcast.
I would add, John, that often in my observation, those who want to take advantage of medical aid in dying laws, assisted suicide, that sort of thing, feel a pressure. They feel a kind of pressure to unburden their loved ones, to get out of the way, to stop being a financial hardship, and so forth. And I think that this, I would encourage this listener to kind of reach into this friend's life and try to discern whether that kind of pressure is being brought to bear, whether this person feels that he's a burden, that he needs to just get out of the way and leave his family or his friends to go on and live their lives. And then to fight that and make sure he knows that's not true, that he's not a burden, and that his life is valuable and that his life is worth living in whatever condition, because life is intrinsically worth living due to the image of God in each of us, due to the fact that
the stats back you up on this. And this is, sometimes when I share this statistic, people are really shocked, but you need to know it. So Oregon's had doctor-assisted suicide for what, 30 years now? Are we up to 30? Something in that range.
It's been a long time, yeah.
It's been a while. In Colorado, I watched the whole movement sell us doctor-assisted suicide in 2016 and overwhelmingly passed. It was universally sold on alleviation of physical pain. 30 years after Oregon legalized doctor-assisted suicide, the data tells us that 80% of those who have chosen it do not identify physical pain as the cause. 20% do. 80% identify emotional suffering of some kind. I mean, that's a remarkable data point. Now, again,
it's unreal.
There's still 20% that identify physical pain. And I would say then we need a better physical pain regimen because there are pain management tools. But 80%, they're pointing, the reason that they're considering this has to do with, like you said, feeling like a burden, being lonely. These are things that Christians can step into.
This is the normalization of suicide that we're seeing in so many areas of our society. Absolutely. In other countries, especially. Once upon a time, someone who said, I'm going to kill myself, I'm having suicidal thoughts, would have been taken in for care and then nursed back to psychological health, and not allowed to harm themselves. Now we actually have clinics that allow people to go through with that. And what message does that send, John? I mean, think about if you were suffering with suicidal ideation and you knew that there was an entire system set up by your country's healthcare that would allow you to just go and get a legal, legitimate assisted suicide. I mean, wouldn't you feel that you were being pushed in that direction? That was the legally sanctioned law, the legally sanctioned option? We talked just a moment ago about the law being a teacher. The law is teaching people here, with whether you're talking about Oregon or Canada or any other place where assisted suicide has become sort of the method of choice for ending emotional or physical suffering. We're teaching people that this is the way out, that you don't actually have to deal with these things, that nobody around you has to deal with your difficulty. They can just shrug it off and send you on your way. And that's evil. That's grotesque and it's evil, and we should be able to speak out against that as a policy. But that's an entirely different issue from dealing with an individual, because that's a very tender situation.
Well, look, if suicide is an option medically for the elderly, I don't know how we can tell a student who can't see past a social media bullying incident in their own life that suicide's not an option for them, right? Yeah. I mean, it's just inconsistent and it's awful. The message is awful.
Well, folks, we're out of time for today. Come to breakpoint.org for links to all the resources that John and I have mentioned on today's program. And be sure to check out the rich Christian commentary we've got there for you on everything going on right now in our culture, updated daily. That's breakpoint.org. For the Colson Center and for John Stonestreet, I'm Shane Morris. Thanks so much for listening.